This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. We're going to be talking this morning about a word that we're hearing way too much about, and that is the word tariffs. It's frontline news every time you look up. CNN will cover it, and all the social media just loves to rant and rave about it. So we're going to be talking about tariffs. And I have one little, hardly a joke, but it's to say that tariffs are the devil's way of teaching us economics.
Interesting.
I think it's very interesting.
It's very interesting.
Interesting. Because quite frankly, I said that's, should we say, tongue in cheek. The truth of the matter is most people hadn't even heard of the word tariffs 3 months ago, or if they did, they weren't paying a lot of attention. Now everybody has become a walking dictionary on tariffs and balance of payments and money supply and trade flows and all this kind of stuff. So
Yes.
we're seeing all this being brought to the table.
Well, they're learning and understanding the impact.
Yeah, and I mean, what we're going to talk a bit about this morning is the whole concept of tariffs, what they really mean. And the reason, and you might think, well, isn't this a time for economic discussion? And the answer is yes, it is. But there's two things I've noticed. One is that good economics translate into good relationships with individuals and people, and vice versa. So you can't disentangle the two. You can't say the economics are good, but the relationship with the people is terrible. If that is true, then the economics are terrible.
Right.
They have to be in sync. They have to be aligned with one another. And the other thing about this business of tariffs that I want to explore this morning is Respectonomics has an enormous part to play in this business of tariffs. And you might think immediately, oh, you mean economically. And I'm moving away from the economics. We'll talk a bit about them. But the real point is this, though. We individually, collectively, corporately, any which way you want to slice this one, we all put up tariffs. We do tariffs in our lives to protect ourselves. If you go back to the original idea of a tariff, there were two reasons for it. One is a very good one, and that is, you remember when you had a little child, a little baby?
Yeah.
Remember those days? It was only a few years ago. Just a few years ago, wasn't it?
Well, more than a few, but
Like,
yes.
maybe 10 years ago. Let's be, Anyway, the point of the story is when you think about a baby, though, it's an infant, and your primary concern is to protect that baby.
Absolutely.
And I'm not about your maternal instinct. I'm talking about us societally. We gravitate to looking after people who can't protect themselves. That's
right.
I think, a sort of a tribal sort of paradigm. Where this goes wrong, however, is if you have a tariff that is protecting the infant, I think we'd all agree that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
The one that's not okay is the tariff that is designed to protect declining industries. If your industry is in decline and you say, I can make it all better by bringing in tariffs, I can assure you it will all end in economic tears. It always does, because you're disrupting the natural flow. You know how with water, for example, you take a river and you say, we're going to redirect this river because we wanted to do this, that, and the other. It might be a hydroelectric scheme. It might be irrigation, whatever. Have you noticed there's always consequences? It's not a straight line. It doesn't always do exactly what you thought it was going to do. Or if it did,
always impact.
There's a lot of stuff that comes with it. So I think when we look at tariffs strictly from an economic point of view and look at them as being a defensive mechanism to defend a declining industry, it's almost like the tariff is telling us something. It's actually admitting that what we've got on the home front isn't very effective. It is not doing its job properly. It needs these artificial barriers. And again, you might say to me, Sarah, well, what's this got to do with Respectonomics? And the reason it does is because when you have a tariff economically, which we've just talked about, you also get a tariff societally and organizationally.
So what do you mean? What do you mean by that?
What I mean is, if you think of a tariff as being a wall or an import control, but something that's being put up it stems the free flow of goods and services. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah.
And every economist will say, oh, yes, but here are some advantages. Okay, we're not going to talk about those advantages now. What we're going to talk about is these are interruptions to the natural flow of goods and services. And that is also true in relationships in today's society. People are finding, and we've talked about this so many times, people feel isolated, people feel lonely, people feel unappreciated, people have no idea where they fit in, people do not trust the political system, people do not trust the capitalist system, people do not trust business. So
overall, sounds like a blanket statement of a lack of trust.
Lack of trust, exactly. So when you have that lack of trust, if you think about it, trust is something that exists when you've got openness. I mean, we use words like integrity, we throw these words around, but trust is really a proxy on transparency.
Yeah.
You can read me and you can say, yeah, you're telling it the way it is, and we can go from that. And what's happening organizationally is, if you look at this concept of hierarchy between, shall we say, the senior manager, the senior officer, the senior bureaucrat, and those at the proverbial shop floor, the
Yes.
gap between those two is a gap that is, in fact, almost an expression of tariff, is an expression of don't come into my territory and I won't come into yours. It's a push away.
Mm.
And I think it's
feel that gap is growing?
Absolutely. We can prove it mathematically because we know that salaries, for example, I think in your world, don't you talk about emolument? Isn't that one of your favorite words? It's a word to say that's your total package of salary and pensions and health benefits.
Yes, they usually refer to it as your compensation package or
your compensation package. Okay. But you see, what we've done is if you look at compensation packages today, how come there are so many jobs that will not pay over $25 an hour?
Right.
And why is it that a CEO can walk away with 10, 20, $30 million in a year? I mean, I'll give you an example of that. At the Boeing Corporation, I find it very strange that the CEO makes more than the machinist. Because when I was last in an airplane, the only person that mattered to me was the machinist and the pilot. But the machinist.
We've shared that conversation before, haven't we?
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of want him to make sure the doors have been screwed on properly.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think we want to be very aware of the importance that everybody has organizationally. It is often said that in a corporation, the word corporation is from the Latin corpus, meaning a body. And if you look at your own body, you don't say that your left hand is more important than your right hand.
Right.
You don't your body does different things functionally, but hierarchically, the body is all equal and all important.
Right.
I heard it once said, somebody said, well, I feel like the little toe. Well, maybe you feel like the little toe, but it is the little toe that gives you balance.
So what's the purpose then of tariffs as you're relating it to Respectonomics?
Because I think what's happening is that we've got this divide that's taking place. The word tariff that is coming into play today is designed to stop this free flow of goods. I think we can agree on that. In other words, I mean, the conventional comment today is we're not going to let in copper, lead, lumber, zinc, and oil because we're going to make it ourselves or produce it ourselves.
Right.
It's all sort of bring it home. Isolationism doesn't work. Can you imagine a corporation where one person is not talking to another? And that's what we're creating, this atmosphere where one person
I was going to say, I can. I've witnessed it firsthand.
We all have.
Right. Yes.
And
yeah.
you've heard me say, and I hope our listeners have heard, that terrible line I heard once, which was said to me at the boardroom table, Jeremy, you don't understand.
Right.
I mean, I know there's different ways of phrasing that, but what's more important was the thought behind it.
So what are some of the consequences that you see from a Respectonomics point of view in terms of tariffs as we're relating it to the elements of Respectonomics?
Well, I think in every organization, if you look at the human body, you and I would quickly agree that each part depends on the other.
Mm-hmm.
It's
They're all
very,
interconnected.
it's all interconnected. And in the corporate world, and we keep talking about the corporate, but corporate, political, organizational, tribal, it doesn't matter which kind of societal definition you're using. The fact is, we all need each other. And when we put up something that impedes the flow of that help to each other, then we in fact operate below our potential. Isn't it interesting that coincidental with what seems to be this rise in separation, this rise in the lack of awareness, this lack of appreciation, have you noticed that with those dynamics, which a lot of people might just say, oh, Jeremy, oh, Sarah, you're just being very moralistic. No, we're not. I mean, we are, because in fact, it's morally correct to pay attention to the other human being.
Right.
But the key is that when I don't pay attention and I don't employ the characteristics and the benefits and the depth of another human being, I'm shooting myself in the foot because I'm not getting the best benefit of that individual. Have you noticed that? I'm sorry, I didn't really finish this line.
No, that's okay.
And that is, with this, let's just call it depreciating, lack of awareness, whatever you want to call it. Whatever you call that, have you noticed that with that has become a decline in productivity?
Mm-hmm.
And if you
And
talk, sorry.
I was going to say that lack of potential when you're applying that to, I'm going to make an assumption that you're talking about that lack of potential to the individual.
Yeah.
But in turn, similar to your analogy with the river, that's going to flow through to lack of potential of the overall, whether it be an organization, a community, what have you.
But let's look at that for a minute. Let's take the position that somebody's got the proverbial jolly good idea, but feels intimidated, doesn't feel they have the right of access. They don't feel they can open the door of the CEO or the CFO, whoever it happens to be, and say, hey, I've got a great idea.
Right.
And I think most of us, believe it or not, if you sat people down, it's fun doing this, by the way, and saying to people, you drive a car and you this, that, and the other. What improvements would you like to see or enhancements would you like to see in those things? And I think we'd be amazed at the quality of stuff that comes out. My favorite example at the moment is I drive a Nissan truck. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. And it has two little buttons in it amongst the other buttons. But two of the buttons are, one turns the heat on the steering wheel, heated
My
steering
favorite.
wheel. Your favorite. Yes, I know you'd love that. But the other one it does also is, and I think this is crazy, is a button that warms the side mirrors so that the ice can't build up on it. Now, I say that's a bit silly because, quite frankly, that should operate on the basis of sensors, not on me physically having to push a button.
Fair.
Number one.
Intuitive.
Number two, yeah.
Intuitive.
Exactly. And number two, isn't it interesting? And this sounds incredibly petty, but those two buttons are on timers. Fine. I don't quite know why, but anyway. I mean, if you think of it, why not have me be the one that turns it on and off?
Well, if they're having you turn it on,
then yeah, exactly. That's a very logical point. But here's the interesting thing, and that is those buttons actually have different timers on them. So the steering wheel heater stays on longer than the side view mirrors heaters. Well, actually, what matters more?
Being able to see.
And but here's a fascinating segue to that. I think you and I intuitively agree that needs to be fixed, discussed, and so on. That's straightforward. But I mentioned this to one individual who said to me, oh, well, you've obviously got too much time to think about things like that. And that answer was a put down. But not only was it a put down, it was also very, I think, symptomatic of thinking that you hear when you go forward with an idea. And if I come up to you with an idea and you say, well, you've got too much time on your hands, I'm unlikely to come forward with another idea.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is where I'm talking about the barriers, the tariffs, the import controls, whatever you want to call them. We all know where a barrier makes sense. So, for example, if you go to an airport, I think a barrier that separates me from falling into the engine of the plane, I think that's a good barrier. I will accept the wisdom of that. But the barriers we're talking about are these artificial barriers that exist between people. And I think one of the problems with tariffs is this. They're becoming commonplace. They're becoming cultural.
Mm,
There are two problems with this. Number one, if you have tariffs, barriers in one place, hop, skip, and a jump, you're going to have them everywhere.
right.
It's a cultural thing. Well, if you're going to stop me coming into with my goods and services, I'm going to stop you coming in with your ideas. It's got a certain sort of symbiosis with it. It's a
Hmm.
very dangerous place to be. We cannot assume that an individual does not have worthwhile, good ideas. The other way around makes a lot of sense. People
Hmm.
have terrific ideas. And I think one of the problems with this tariff business, again, is it's restricting the flow of information, or at least the flow of goods and services. We know that.
Yeah.
But if it's also restricting the flow of information, that means it's impinging on productivity and innovation. That's
Yeah.
an equation. But here's something else. If I come to you with an idea, and I keep saying with an idea, because actually I think you should be you generically.
Right.
Sarah should come to Jeremy, and as you have done many a time, and say, do you have ideas on this? And you start feeding me with things for me to think about,
Right.
because you don't know what I'm going to think about. And it's extraordinary how in our conversations we go back and forth and come out with new ideas all the time.
Yes. Yes.
I believe it's called catalytical.
Yes, it is.
It's my latest word.
It is. And it's a fantastic word.
I think it exists. I don't know. Anyway,
I also find when you were speaking about the tariffs and kind of the going back and forth, I think it puts people on the defensive. And it's also in the delivery in terms of how you're having the dialogue about the tariffs. We're all aware that, some type of, I'm going to equate it to policy or procedure is necessary.
yeah,
However, like you say, then you're getting a chain reaction of it being from a negative vantage point versus it being a discussion or working through maybe a challenge
right. Yeah.
together, right?
I mean, I have to tell you one economic truth behind the tariffs, which is almost got a smile on its face, but it works like this. These tariffs are forcing us to segment, to look at different markets. So if your market is going to cost more for me to be in than another market, it doesn't take me long to say I'm sending my ships to Bolivia because I can get a better price
Right.
there. So in a sense, it's the sort of capitalism in the sense
Mm-hmm.
where money will flow to its natural level. So that's okay. But here's the catch to the whole tariff business. And that is, if you put a tariff in place and restrict the flow of goods and services, so we'll just use Canadian oil. So we're going to be tagged with selling Canadian oil into the American market. Yes?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, what we will do then is we'll start shipping around and looking around for different markets.
Right.
So we'll start sending more oil to Europe or more oil to South America or whatever it is. We will find different markets. That's the natural navigational flow of money, is how it works.
Right.
Anyway, here's the problem. So we start developing these new markets that now take all the Canadian oil. It's not too much of an imagination to say that in 6 months' time, a year's time, whenever it is, that other market, in this case the United States, comes back to us and says, we would like to have your oil after all. To which
Mm-hmm.
we say, sorry, it's already spoken for.
Right.
So in other words, if you translate this into people, you put up a barrier where the flow of information is going somewhere else. The trouble is, then you go back to the individual 6 months later and say, I'd like to talk about your ideas. And the person just shrugs their shoulders and says, well, I've already told it to somebody else and you're out of luck. I'm not
Right.
going to share it
Right.
with you. So it's an incredibly negative experience. It's an
Mm-hmm.
experience that precludes me coming forward with new ideas. And I think it's also self-perpetuating. In other words, it's so easy. We do it in our own relationships and lives. We
Mm-hmm.
put up barriers because then I don't have to think about it
Right.
or
I was
whatever
just going to say it's so applicable to individuals and their individual relationships. It could be in family, it could be amongst friends, it could be amongst teams, sports teams,
Absolutely. So
a community, and again, also like you say, corporate is the typical one that we will go to, but
you know all about sports teams, don't you?
just a little bit.
I thought you did. It's interesting you even bring that out because when you think of a sports team, I mean, you think of, you know, I don't know, Super Bowl or whatever you want to think of. But when you see those, you think of the team operating coherently, concisely, working everybody together. And I think you'll tell me that isn't always the case.
It isn't always the case, but funny, if you listen to some of the commentaries from some of the pro athletes where there is overall team success,
Right.
they'll more often than not say it's that the players are not selfish, right? They're thinking about the team collectively as a whole versus each individual thinking solely of themselves.
That is a very interesting proxy expression on tariffs because a tariff is effectively selfish. It's my business, it's my way, it's my highway. I don't want you in my market. And if you're going to be in my market, I'm going to make you pay for it.
Right.
That is overall a selfish attitude. And secondly, it's also counterproductive.
Mm.
I mean, you go back to your Adam Smith. Everybody's read The Wealth of Nations from 1760. Haven't you? Haven't you?
I'm going to not comment on that.
Okay. Well, Adam Smith is a fully clever chap.
My non-comment is a comment. I have
Yeah,
not.
exactly. And the only problem with Adam Smith, he was Scottish. I've got nothing. I don't want to make any speech, but I think I ought to say that. Anyway, Adam Smith was brilliant, and he talked about the whole concept of free trade. And the whole concept behind it, I know everybody says, oh, but can't we produce it all ourselves? No,
Right.
because in your own
Not
life,
feasible.
it's not feasible. In your own life and our own personal lives, people do people do things better than I do. So, for example, if somebody cooks better than I do, why don't we have that person do the cooking and have me do the cleaning up?
Right.
Division of labor and all that. But between the two of us, we get a lot more done. And
Right.
corporations, organizations, let's say organizations, need to be very aware of the mitigation against productivity, against communication, when in fact we do not embrace that other human being. I've said this repeatedly that any economic transaction, I don't care how complicated it is, you can talk to me about balance of payments and swap deposits and interprovincial something or other, but at the heart of every, or not even at the heart, at the beginning and the end of every economic transaction is a human being. So our responsibility is to bring those two ends of the equation closer together.
I've heard you speak before about reciprocity and leapfrogging.
Mm-hmm. Well,
What can you share with?
reciprocity is a very polite word, and you've noticed it they're using it the word today. The authorities are running around saying, and we're going to introduce reciprocal tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, the truth of the matter is they're retaliatory. And there's a great deal of difference between reciprocity and retaliation.
Right. Well, I mean, you
I,
have to look at what's just gone on in the last
Mhm.
week or so, right?
Yeah, yeah, and it's borderline childish. How often did you say to the children in the sandbox, please do not throw sand at each other. The sand is there to be played with for the benefit of everybody.
Right.
We start throwing sand at each other, we all get blinded.
Right.
Not a,
Yes.
not a, not a clever
It's
combo.
not advantageous on either
No.
side.
So
Yeah.
I think the key here is number one, when we talk about a tariff in terms of it being destructive,
Mm-hmm.
I think the word retaliation is a far safer word to use. And what was the other word you asked me to comment on? Sorry.
Reciprocity and leapfrogging.
Yeah, leapfrogging is something we're getting into. It goes back, actually, it was more or less, it was a big union issue back in the 60s. And what happened was a union would say, we're going for a 10% increase. Labor relations were so appalling that another union in another business would say, you're going for 10%, we're going for 20.
Right.
So you start leapfrogging over people, which takes you out of the whole, reality of the value of the work and so on.
Right. Right.
It becomes very ugly.
It
We
goes to the
run that,
wayside.
yeah, and we run the risk, in fact, of being leapfrogging one another when we create these silos, when we don't pay attention to other people. I
Right.
think this business of a tariff is far more serious than just the pure economics. The economics will sort themselves out. They always do.
Right.
We'll
Yes.
find other markets. We'll become better at producing. We'll reduce our prices. The Canadian dollar will go down and we'll be cheaper in another person's market. I mean, and this isn't just a Canadian point of view. It could be a
Right.
German point of view, anybody's. So a lot of these things are, in fact, self-writing. I don't know if you've noticed this in economics, but when everybody becomes an expert on a subject, is
Mm-hmm.
usually when the whole business has already been reflected in the markets. It's already there. It's done. And you
Well,
want
it's
to,
all and it's available there now for
yeah,
people to learn and
yeah,
educate, right?
it's there. It's there. So now we go on to the next chapter, as it were. And
Right.
I think that one of the things I want to emphasize is, I said earlier, if my oil has now gone to a different market, and the Americans then, shall we say, come back and say, well, actually, on second thoughts, we would like your oil. And then we say, well, sorry, it's gone already. That in the organizational world happens as well, which is when you come to me and you say, I'm looking forward to your ideas. And you say, actually, I've given them already to somebody else.
Right.
And the way we reflect that is by going to work for another organization.
Going to say that that corresponds or flows down to retention and to
Absolutely.
engagement.
Exactly.
And then if you think big picture at what the cost that is associated with training or educating an individual in their work environment, and if they had the foresight and the proactive insights initially, it would be costing less.
Oh, it'd be far less money. And I mean, in other words, good relationships make good business. I mean, and
Yeah,
good business makes good relationships. It's a lovely
correct.
equation. But I think one of the
Absolutely.
things we want to hone in on, if we've beaten up on the idea that there's a tariff between two segments of an organization, between, shall
Yeah.
we say, between the board and the somebody on the shop floor. Let's just agree for a minute. There's a tariff in between. There's an import control. There's something that's restricting the flow of information and ideas.
There's a
I think,
barrier.
I think actually most of us are very aware of the loneliness and the frustration in people's lives.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
know it's, Main Street, wherever, New York, London, whatever, that loneliness is very prevalent. We know that. By the way, my favorite example of loneliness is going to a McDonald's. You know what I mean by McDonald's? I don't know if you ever go in there.
I think I've heard of McDonald's.
All right. And have you ever been in there for your quarter pounder, or do you go there for the French fries?
Big Mac.
That's atrocious. They're not.
Go
But
big or go home, isn't it?
exactly. But have a look next time you go into McDonald's, because McDonald's is all to do with McSmiley. It's all
Mhm.
to do with happy people, and they have those great big cartoony, whatever they call those figures,
The characters, yes, yeah.
like yeah, with smiles and all that stuff. Go into McDonald's, 11 o'clock in the morning when people are coming in for lunch and all that stuff, and look around. And I want you to tell me one thing. Do a survey. How many smiles do you see
Behind the counter or
anywhere?
guests?
Anywhere. It's a very, very interesting problem. You see a lot of skulls behind the counter.
Mhm,
Truth be told, you see a lot of, it's not called skulls, but what is it when somebody's looking at their iPhone instead of talking to the person opposite?
mhm.
Is that not a trade barrier? Is that not a tariff in itself? That would put
Disengagement,
disengagement. Anything that smacks of disengagement is, in fact,
right.
likely to be a barrier to good communication.
I wanna say so disengagement, yes, but just to on the flip side, food for thought here, no pun intended, but people will often, like, look at their phones or engage with their
Right.
phones because they're lonely. So there's comfort if you're in solitude or by yourself or you're not
Oh,
communicating with other people,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's a way in which I get included.
It's a
Um,
barrier, but it's also
oh,
comfort,
it's a comfort
right?
zone. So, but in fact, it's also like a vortex. It's a very
Mhm.
dangerous one because the
Yes,
loneliness breeds. I'm identifying myself through my iPhone. Well, the more I identify myself through my iPhone, more
the
likely
less I'm
I'm
engaged.
going to be more lonely.
Yep,
I think
agreed.
loneliness is, and I think organizations have a tremendous responsibility to look at loneliness as a subject. And I'd like to sort of spend a little time, if we may. I think we've beaten up, if you will, on the ideas of barriers and tariffs and
Yes,
so on in
yes,
an
yeah.
organization. And I think any CEO or manager would say to me and say to you, what are the next steps?
Yes.
In other words, we run
We
the
recognize these are here. How do we navigate and
right.
move forward? Yes.
Because I think and I've noticed this in politics, it's so easy to be so critical of somebody else's performance, and maybe justly so. I'm not making that speech, but how often do you not hear a reciprocal response that says, and this is what we would do?
Yes.
You don't get, this is what we would do. And you do, you get that ghastly generic, well, we would do a better job. That's not
Right.
exactly how you include somebody in a conversation. I'll do a better job than you, Sarah.
Right.
No, that's not right.
Or just a blanket statement. We'll
Yeah.
we'll we'll aim to do better. Well, what is the action plan?
Yeah.
What are the steps that are being implemented?
So let's talk about the steps. Okay. And you and I are going to have probably, I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't a 5-part series on the compass.
Yes.
And the compass is showing each person what the other human being looks like and how we can interact with that part of that person. So, in other words, if I'm going into a shopping mall, I think the right thing for me to do would be at least to look around to see if I should be holding the door for anybody.
Mm-hmm.
My old fashioned world, I know, but my old fashioned world, if I see a lady, I always hold the door open for her. I do. And I'm waiting for listeners to call in and say that I am whatever I am, antediluvian, out of date, prelapthian. And
I
that,
personally don't think that is. I think it's a common courtesy. Not necessarily just from the gentleman to the woman, but thinking about other people or looking at circumstances. How
exactly.
can I be of service? How can I help?
Give you an example of that. I went one day, I was in a financial organization and I went to see to see the CEO. Oh, sorry, she wasn't, but it doesn't matter. But at that rank anyway, on the executive committee, and it was very interesting. We had a meeting, had a very successful meeting. Blah 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 blah. I got up to leave, and all she said was goodbye.
Mm,
Well, actually, good manners would have been let me see you to the elevator door, or do you know your way out, or
right.
but something that would, you know, be a little more sort of lubricating good
Engaging,
manners.
communicative.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So I think one of the things that we should hone in on is when we're talking respectonomics and we're talking about people, you said a moment ago the issue of courtesy.
Yes.
I think Peter Drucker got it absolutely right. Peter Drucker, the management consultant, he's no
Yes.
longer with us. But Peter Drucker had a wonderful thought or a principle. If you're asking somebody to do more for you,
Mm-hmm.
if you, for example, were to say to me, Jeremy, I want you to take on the Middle East as one of your markets or something like that. That would seem very straightforward. His approach was to treat me like a volunteer.
Right.
Treat me like, Jeremy, we know you've done a great job on A, B, and C. Would you have time to take on this other opportunity here? Blah, 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 blah. But it turns the whole thing around from being a dictatorial hierarchical
Mm-hmm.
to a drawing alongside. It's a parable in itself.
Right.
Beautiful. So that's one thing. So just being aware and extending courtesies to other people. The idea of even holding a door open, man or woman or child, has got nothing
Yes.
to do with it.
Yep.
Has everything to do with paying attention. Have you
Yes.
noticed if you ever go into I say a shopping mall, go to McDonald's, have you ever noticed it's kind of interesting to watch how many people go through the door without looking to see if there's anybody behind them?
Oh, yes. Awareness.
Hmm. So I think awareness as a single word is something that you can very inexpensively take home. You can get out an index card and even write down a few things about how you can be more aware of other people.
Mm.
It just as a subject. Then I think what we need to do and the organization needs to do, and this is where the compass will come into its own. But
Yeah.
in brief, there are 7 things that are necessary for our existence. There's just nothing you and I can do about it. I wrote them all down this morning,
Which
and
we talked about early on.
We've talked about them.
Yeah.
But the necessities of living, I said seven. I think it's, yeah, seven. That's right. Is food and shelter. You need those. You need water and you need oxygen. I think everybody would go there. We also need other people,
Mm-hmm.
critical point, which is at the heart of respectonomics. One
Yeah.
person needs another. We need light. If you don't have light, you will likely trip over your feet every morning.
Right.
I mean, what's the first thing you do? Turn on the light to see where you left something you shouldn't have. And then, and the last one is, and this is really important, is rest.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody needs rest. And you've heard me say it too many times. The heart works on the basis of one pulse and one rest. Well,
Right.
at 50% of the time it's at rest. I think that's a message for the human being. Rest is vital to the process.
It is.
Yeah.
It's because our society's gone the complete opposite direction, where the harder you work or the busier you
Yeah.
are means that equates to you're more productive or you're above someone else.
Exactly.
Right. And that's not the case.
No. So what I'd like to do here, very, very, very briefly, but with your HR background, I would like to look at an organization. And by organization, I know we tend to say corporate, but it
Yes.
really does, it really
An
migrates.
organization can be 3 people.
Exactly. You've said this before. The 3 people
Yes.
that the 30,000 doesn't make a
30,000.
difference. They're the same dynamics.
Yes.
But also, when we talk about organizations, we can be talking about the family unit. We can be talking about a community organization. We can talk about a faith organization, service organization, whatever it happens to be.
Sports team.
Yeah. It will,
Right.
a sports team. Exactly.
Yeah.
I think we can all identify with the different groups with which we are connected and to find out within those groups. So it might be in your place of work, for example, but you
Right.
ask yourself, what is the corporation doing for me, Jeremy, Sarah, whoever your name is? What is the corporation doing for me in relation to my body?
Mm-hmm.
What are they doing in relation to my mind? What are they doing in relation to my soul? Everybody, when they hear the word, what are you doing for my soul, pretty much flies for the boundaries and says, that's not what we're going to talk about.
Right.
All we are talking about is the necessities of living,
Mm-hmm.
which we just talked about, the food and the shelter and so on. Let's take food and shelter. You need food and shelter for the body, you need food and shelter for the mind, and you need food and shelter for the soul. And everybody can make, yeah, and we've talked about that. But what I'm really trying to drive at is organizationally, the organization needs to be thinking about what are they doing to engage with, one of your words, to engage with or to supply the needs of the human being when it comes to food, shelter, water, oxygen, and so on. Now, these sound a little bit allegorical, and in a way they're almost metaphors in themselves. Actually, food ain't no metaphor. That's called your wages.
Right.
So you get, sorry.
I was going to say, and I think that is a magnetic relationship from the vantage point that the individual also needs to put some thought into that as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. And 2 levels. One level is that the individual who's at the receiving gate of these wages and shelter and safety and security and all those good things. The word we were using earlier was reciprocity, as against retaliation.
Right.
Too many people organizationally engage in retaliation. This is what you did to me. This is why, therefore, what I am going to do for you. And it's sandbox material and it's incredibly destructive. But how much healthier if we were to look at the corporation or the business, whatever it is, has done this for me. In turn, what can I do for the organization?
Exactly.
What can I do to build up the body of the corporation or the body of the president or the CEO?
Right.
It doesn't just stop at the big picture. It also goes to the heart of the individual. So I think we have a reciprocal responsibility. And with that reciprocal responsibility, I think what happens is we find out a lot about each other with strengths and insights and ideas, new markets, new ways of approaching how to manufacture, sell, whatever it is. I think it's a Pandora's box, not a Pandora's box of things that are harmful, a
Right.
Pandora's box of stuff that is absolutely amazing.
Right. Right. We're all unique in our
Mhm.
own way, and we all have
Absolutely.
things that we can contribute and bring to the table. So I think those key points that you've hit on will make for great content for our listeners for our next series of segments of podcasts.
I agree, and therefore can we say in unison, we rest our
That's our
case.
case.
Okay.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you, Sarah.